Welcome back to the Chicagolandians, a casual Chicago sports podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Cunningham, joined by my co-host, Connor Cunningham.
We're two brothers from the Chicagoland area talking about the latest and greatest in Chicago sports news.
Welcome back to another episode of the Chicagolandians. I'm your host, Patrick Cunningham, joined as always by Connor Cunningham.
Hello. That's me coming in on an airplane.
On today's episode, we had a special guest, Quinten Krzysko of On Tap Sports, who is one of Connor's colleagues. And in this interview today, we talked about Quinten's early career, but then also that Bears offensive line, why we're having some of the struggles we're having 4 games into the season, what needs to change, and then what did look different this week that I thought was a great interview. Connor, what'd you think of it?
Yeah, it was super cool to talk to him. I will say I know jack about offensive lines. I know the concept of power, and I understand a little bit of how trap works. But besides that, I know pretty much nothing about run blocking schemes, pass protection, or anything offensive line related. So to get his opinions and takes is super interesting. Just talking from him for 30 minutes, I learned a lot more about the offensive line. And moving forward, I'm going to try to have a little more nuanced of an opinion on the offensive line instead of just seeing Coleman Shelton get bounced like a little baby doll across the screen, try to relax a little bit more. But I thought it was a super interesting interview, and I really enjoyed talking to him.
Oh, man. As soon as it started, when he explained the difference between zone and power and the difference in... I mean, for the longest time, I just thought it was like, which direction you're going.
Yeah, which direction you're going.
How far are you doing?
Which hole you hit.
Yeah, which hole you're hitting. And he's talking about the different, it's like a zone blocking versus... power. You're literally trying to get vertical versus horizontal. I thought, it's very interesting. New perspective that I didn't really know about. But before we get there, we have some notable Chicago news to mention. First thing we have here, the White Sox set the record. We did it. Set the record for most losses in the modern MLB history with 121 losses. Woo. It was so funny to see. I don't know kind of if you saw this, but like once we hit 120 losses, the next couple games were like pretty packed relative to like, every other game that we've had in the last 40 games we've had.
Cool. On the brink of history, man.
Oh, yeah. Everyone wanted to come in, and there's so many videos of people chanting expletives to Jerry Reinsdorf and also like sell the team. It's a pretty funny environment to see, but we didn't go straight.
I honestly got a little nervous that we weren't going to do it.
I got a little nervous. I think once we hit 120 losses, we went on a 3-game heater win streak before dropping that last one, but we did it.
Yeah, they wouldn't let us get the record at home. Ricky's boys just wouldn't quit. They swept whoever they were playing at home, and then they had to go to Detroit to lose. Funny enough that it was at Detroit against the Tigers where our former announcer, Jason Benetti, called that game. I think that's such a sign of the times to have our team, who is so cheap that we couldn't keep our announcer. He announces the game where we become the worst team in MLB history, and I think that's really a sign of the times. The Tigers become a playoff team with, obviously Jason Benetti's not hitting balls for the Tigers, but he's a part of the culture. I think it's just really something interesting.
It's a pretty depressing time to be one of Jerry's teams this year. On the other half of Jerry's 2 teams, we have the Chicago Bulls. It's notable news this weekend. NBA legend Derrick Rose just retired after, I think, maybe like 15 years in the league.
Crazy.
Obviously, Chicago Bulls legend, youngest MVP, when MVP at 22 years old. The biggest what if in Chicago sports history. I've really enjoyed the last couple of days seeing my whole Twitter feed has just been Derrick Rose highlights.
It's all Derrick Rose highlights.
And it's pretty exciting to see. It makes you pretty happy. It really brings a smile to your face. And you really come to appreciate the true talent of Rose. Oh my God, the athleticism that he had.
Yeah, I think Derrick Rose, probably my favorite athlete of all time. To retire at 35 is nothing to be ashamed of. I feel like that's a quality long career that he's had in the NBA, especially with the injury history that he's had. Should be a career that is 100% celebrated and revered as a successful career in the NBA. Obviously, like, expectations didn't pan out the way that you thought they would, especially with the unreal expectations of being an MVP at 22. But I think, Derrick Rose's career as a whole has been like a success, and it was so fun to watch him. I feel like some of the fondest memories that I have as a Chicago sports fan are because of Derrick Rose. So it's very sad to see him retire, but I don't think it's sad necessarily looking back on what could have been, but just sad to see, a player that you love so much say that he's done playing basketball. Yeah, all the best for Derrick Rose. Loved watching him. I've seen that Goran Dragic dunk now about 100 times in the last week.
I want to go higher.
What a player. What a career. Yeah. Have fun in retirement, Derrick Rose.
And then I think just the last piece of news we'll hit on before introducing the interview. This weekend, Chicago Bears defeated the Los Angeles Rams. This interview we'll cover a little bit of the game, and we'll have some brief talking points, but I think it was significant. We had a great win. Caleb Williams looked pretty good. He did not throw for nearly as many yards, but thankfully he didn't have to. He didn't have to throw the ball 53 times. He only threw the ball 20 times, because we had a very successful run game. Defense was still playing pretty well and just looked a little bit more like a balanced team. I think after a whole week of everyone hating on the Bears run game, we finally figured it out. DeAndre Swift started to look like an actual running back, and our line, as we'll get to in this interview, seemed to be playing at a little bit of a higher level and playing as a team more. But still exciting. Bears 2-2 against a Rams team that I thought when we made our predictions, I think I had this game as a loss. Obviously that they've had a lot of injuries and are not the same team that a preseason team, but still Bears 2-2.
Hey, a win's a win. Their offense looked pretty disheveled with Kyron Williams being their main and only piece of offense that they could get. But hey, a win's a win, and I think Caleb Williams had his best game of his career so far. I think even if the stats weren't there, one thing, he looked great against the pass, or great against the rush. The blitz was something that became a problem against the Texans and even the Colts as well, but Caleb looked very controlled under pressure, and his stats reflected that too. I think he was 7 for 8 against the blitz, threw for a decent amount of yards as well. So I was super happy with how he played. National media will say that he's continuing being a bust just because of his stats, but I think if you watch the game, if you know ball, you know that he did have a good game, and he's just continuing to get better, continuing to be more confident in this offense. So overall, I thought it was a super encouraging game. Obviously, it was disappointing to see in the first half when the Bears had, I believe, 60 yards of penalties and 93 yards of offense. So to see our offense almost get outpaced by our penalties is something that's disappointing, but we pulled it together at the end. And Pat, do you know that the Bears are now have won 7 straight at home, which is the largest win streak in the NFL?
I did not know that. I think Williams is the first QB. I saw some weird stat today about him being the first QB to win like his first 2 home games as like a first round pick or something. It seemed like a very nitpicky stat, but Bears at home, we really hold it down.
No, but Bears win. Super excited. I think that's all I got to say about it.
Gotcha. So that'll do it for our Chicago news. I think now we're going to introduce you. We're going to segue you into our interview with Quinten Krzysko, and we'll touch base after the interview. See you guys later.
All right, and welcome back. Today we are joined now by a special guest on the show, Quinten Krzysko. Q, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, my name is Quinten Krzysko. I write over at OnTapSportsNet.com. I do the Bears on Tap podcast as well, and I also do a NFL/betting podcast called the Shaving Points podcast. So make sure to go check out my work there. But I'm excited to be on the show with you guys, excited to sit down and talk some offensive line.
Heck yeah, man. So we just came off of a nice Week 4 win against the Los Angeles Rams. Felt like there was some different things that we saw with the offensive line, especially in the running game, but we kind of just wanted to address the offensive line as a whole. It's been a huge talking point for Caleb Williams and the offense throughout the entire season. Kind of just to get started, how is the offensive line?
Man, that is such a subjective question to me. And it's something that I find myself getting over defensive of the offensive lineman. I'm like, why do I care this much that everyone says Coleman Shelton sucks when I'm just like, he's not good, but I don't think he's awful either. And it's just like, I look around the league. I look at a team like the Rams. I look at a team like the Commanders. I say, Bears offensive line is more talented than them. Why do I watch the games and say Matt Stafford has plenty of time? Why does Jaden Daniels look like he has all day to look around? So it's a tough question to really answer because it's like, I know there's talent there. But there, to this point in the season, there's been some disconnect, something missing. I don't know if it's familiarity. I don't know if it's coaching. There was a quote that came out this week from the Bears that was really telling to me. It was like something about calling plays that they've practiced in the last month.
Mm.
And it was just like, that was a red flag to me of like, when I watched this run scheme, these guys looked like they had no idea what they were doing because they might not have. It
Yeah.
might have been stuff that they installed 3 months ago in camp and never did again until it's called on game day. And they're going, well, we don't have experience next to each other. I don't know how many steps the guy next to me is taking lateral before he gets vertical. I don't like when you're an offensive line, right? Especially in a zone, like the outside zone concepts, you're trying to be a wall in a sense. And if you're not hip to hip there, knee to knee, there's going to be busts in it. That continuity, that knowledge of each other, of the playbook, of there's so many factors that go into it. And I think today there was a lot that came through today that was like, okay, these guys practice this week.
Yeah.
I can tell they're confident in what they're doing, where they're going, how they're moving. That it makes a big difference when you get that familiarity out.
Well, that makes sense. But with that continuity, I mean, Coleman Shelton is obviously a new addition, but Braxton Jones, Jenkins, Nate Davis, and Darnell Wright, they've been there for a while, right? What do you think that like continuity is like? Why do you think that's lacking? Do you think it was just like off season with like Nate Davis not being available a lot, or like kind of rotating with Shelton and Bates and Davis around?
I think there's some of it there where it's like last week we saw them run a bunch of duo, right? And if you're not familiar with duo, it's like two double teams basically on the D tackles. So you'd have Tevin Jenkins and Coleman Shelton double teaming one D tackle, and you would have Darnell Wright and Matt Pryor doubling the other D tackle. I think a lot of that comes down to you're covering for Coleman Shelton. You know Coleman Shelton can't move someone. So you need to run double teams there to make it work at the point of attack sometimes. And let me go full tinfoil hat here. I think Coleman Shelton cut weight this year. I think
Really?
Shane Waldron wanted to, and don't get me wrong, you go watch his Rams film, his anchor still wasn't there. But like, I don't think it was this bad. And I don't think he was giving up ground this quickly. I think Shane Waldron really wanted to get really wide with his run concepts. And Coleman Shelton had to be the point man on that because he's the undersized, athletic guy who can get out there and really get into space. So I think he said, hey, cut down extra like 10 pounds. Let's see how far we can really get you out there on some nickel corners and some linebackers. And I think it's had a negative effect. Now that is full blown tinfoil hat theory. I like he's listed on the Bears website at 285. He came out of college at 292. He was listed at 299 somewhere in the last few years. I can't find there's not a good history of how much a guy was listed at, but he's listed lighter than he's ever been this year. So I think there might be something to it there. But ultimately, from the continuity standpoint, like you were saying, I mean, Tev and Brax have played plenty next to each other. Nate Davis and Darnell Wright played plenty next to each other. There should be continuity there. But to pull out a bit different of a tinfoil hat theory, I think when they got to camp this year, they said, we got this shiny, brand new toy in Caleb Williams. We got Keenan Allen. We got DJ Moore and Romo Dunze. I think they spent all camp on the passing concepts because Waldron came in here and said, Luke Getsy, he ran a good run scheme. You can say what you want about the guy. He ran a really strong, effective, fun run scheme that was very diverse. So Waldron came in here going, in my theory, this run scheme it's pre-cooked. Just pop it in the microwave and we're good to go. I don't think they practiced much run scheme all camp. And I think it really showed a lot of rust and a lot of getting used to it, getting back in the swing of it. And I'm hoping going forward, it is better as a sign of today. And it wasn't just a weak Rams D line.
Yeah, absolutely. So after this week 4 game, we recently just won against the Rams. I think something that did definitely stand out to me after the first 3 weeks where DeAndre Swift seemed absolutely bottled up. I think through 3 weeks, he had just over 100 yards of rushing. And in 1 week today, he had, I think, 93 yards of rushing. What do you think has changed this week with our run blocking that we haven't seen in the past 3 weeks, you think?
These guys looked like they knew what they were doing. They looked like they were hitting their spots correctly and they were more familiar with the concepts. And I mean, it was even mostly in the second half, right? The first half, the run game was still kind of teetering here and there. I think getting more under center with stuff, more vertical, we saw more power run concepts as opposed to the zone run concepts, which I think the power run seems to be, to me, when I'm watching them, I think that's where their identity starts. And it's tougher without Tevin Jenkins out there because he is like with power runs, you are trying to move people vertically, right? With zone, it's much more moving horizontally. You're just kind of getting in the way and creating seams for the running back. That it's zone is freestyle. It's the running back can go ultimately anywhere. It's his choice. Whereas with power runs, you are saying we are going to blow up this gap and the running back is going through this gap. And that's the play design. And they showed last week into this week too, some ability to blast open some holes, especially when you have Matt Pryor out there, who's just another big body. So I think that helped. But ultimately, it really just comes back to these guys looked like they knew what they were doing there because they were running outside zone. They were getting horizontal. And some of it too was, I think DeAndre Swift stopped screwing around as much. Someone said to him, "Hey, listen, buddy, you got the big new contract, but if this doesn't start working, this kid behind you is getting the carries because he showed an ability to pick up yards the tough way last week. So we need you to start finding these run lanes the way that we were hoping you would coming in the season." And I think that happened today when you saw some of the outside zone stuff. They blocked it up better. He found his run lanes quicker, and he just hit the gas when it was there.
Yeah. I think you've seen that from Swift throughout parts of the season where, like, when he's in open space, I feel like he's dynamic and shifty and he can make plays. And I feel like you even saw that last year with the Eagles, like kind of what you were talking about with power there. Swift dominated in yards before contact, powering through the huge lines or huge holes that the Eagles would create. So I think what's been tough so far is that he just can't find these holes, or maybe the holes aren't there to begin with. But this game, I feel like it was like a revelation with Swift.
From the first few weeks, there were a few glaring examples of you could see a big run lane that he was just missing, and he was cutting back instead of taking that big run lane, and it made some of the offensive linemen look really bad on screenshots because there's a linebacker at the hash, there's an offensive lineman 2 yards to the left of him. It looks like the offensive lineman's doing nothing, but what he was trying to do was cut off that linebacker for the outside run lane. And it looks like he's just staying there, not hitting anyone, but he's waiting for that linebacker to come at him. But if Swift is cutting it back inside, linebacker's never going to come at the offensive lineman there, right? So it's
interesting.
It's stuff that can make it look really, really ugly. But some of that, even on Swift too, to give him a little bit of a break on that, some of it's learning his offensive lineman.
I feel like when I watch the Bears, or I see everyone saw that photo of the option play that we had where all 5 of our offensive linemen were on the ground, or I've seen clips of Coleman Shelton getting tossed across the screen. Is that like the wrong interpretation of offensive lines, or like what do basic fans misunderstand about blocking an offensive lineman? I have a very black and white vision of our offensive line. Seeing Caleb Williams get hit, we're seeing no run lane opening up. Is there like more nuance that I'm just missing, or like?
One, I mean, I would, and I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you the Bears' offensive line has been good. It has,
Yeah,
but
for sure.
when I'm watching the offensive line, and it's it's a tedious job to do. I watched the game 5 times through, once for each
That's
position.
crazy.
And
yeah,
because it's really hard to actually sit there and break down how an offensive lineman did unless you're watching that player every single play. But when I'm watching it, the first thing I ask myself is, what was he asked to do? Right? Offensive line is not as simple as just ball is snapped, hit someone. And that's how it feels a lot of the time, but there's a strategy behind everything, how everything is going. There's a plan in place. So the first thing is, what's the plan? How did he execute it? The second thing is, the plan makes sense. Was it a reasonable ask of this guy? There are some moments where you'll see one of my bigger gripes with Waldron the first few weeks. It felt like he didn't know his personnel, his players, and what they were capable of. You had moments where he was asking Coleman Shelton to cover a gap and a half, 2 gaps across on a linebacker who's clearly faster than him. If there's a linebacker on the opposite hash and he's playing center, that is a heck of a distance for him to cover. So, and that's how you end up with a guy looking embarrassed out there of him just getting knocked out because he's way off balance trying to reach a spot he shouldn't have to necessarily reach. And some of that is like, it's not that you can't ask him to do that, but it's like, we're asking you to do that unless that guy's way over here. Then we need to have an adjustment in the play for, okay, now that's a tight end guy and you're coming backside to get this guy. Like there's different ways that you have to structure it for different looks. And I feel like they weren't doing a lot of that. It was just, man, no matter the look, this is where you're going to. You got to get to this gap, or it might not always be a guy. Sometimes it's a run lane. It's a gap that guy's trying to get to. But I think that's a big part that gets, whenever a guy is getting embarrassed, I just have to ask myself, was it a reasonable ask for him to do this? And if not, what would have the reasonable ask been? Like, how would you adjust the play to that? Because defenses, that's the other thing here. defenses are going to try to make them look bad, right? Like they're not
Yeah.
going to give them the look they want, the ideal look for them to run this play or that play towards. So
Mhm.
you need adjustments within there of how that's going to be done. Now, in pass protection, I mean it's actually a lot simpler than run blocking, I think.
Yeah.
But where you start to get tougher to break down is when you start seeing the blitzes and the wild stunts. Because one thing that has happened this year, I think I heard this on the Athletic Football Show. Robert Mays was talking about how he went to like 22 different training camps, and almost every D coordinator or defensive play caller he talked to was trying to emulate Brian Flores's
Mm.
blitz fronts, stunt schemes, and we can look what the Vikings are doing right now. That team does not have the talent to be performing the way they are defensively.
No.
Brian Flores is testing the limit of how good your defense can be without strong personnel. So we're seeing a lot of different D coordinators who really paid a lot of attention this offseason to pass protection and how to mess with the pass protection rules. And I think the Bears have been below average from a pass protection standpoint, but I don't think they've been bottom 5 in the league because I think the whole league is going through this right now. And I think that's something that's getting missed somewhat is a lot of the league is struggling with stunts and blitzes right now. The Bears are in the lower third of it, but I don't think they're the bottom of the barrel, very worse in the league at it either. Like a lot of people think, every fan base thinks they have the worst O-line in the NFL.
Yeah.
That's just kind of the way it goes.
That's
Um,
funny. Yeah.
And the tough thing with trying to break down pass protection is I can sit here for hours and watch the game over and over and over. I can't tell you what the call was. I can
Yeah.
make some assumptions. I can try to figure it out. When you're grading it, you almost need to be a little conservative with it because you don't want to be bashing a guy for something that was not his fault. But some of that too might come back to you have a rookie calling the protections. There's probably some mistakes in there. So that's going to make your guys look a little worse too. Now, the fact that he's still doing it, it seems to be getting better. I love that because that means that the team is not turning on him over it. You know, Tevin Jenkins is a contract year. If the rookie quarterback's constantly making him look bad, he's taking money out of his pocket. That's something that turns ugly real quick. So I think he has gotten a lot better with it. Not to say it was all him. Ultimately, with O-line, there's a lot of factors at play. And a few things being off throughout a game can make a lot of stuff look even worse.
No, I think those are a lot of really good points. I know Cam Newton had an interesting clip breaking down the option that we had on the goal line, breaking down how Braxton Jones, his like reach block that he had to make on the linebacker there, he obviously fell down and he fell down right away and it was not going to reach there. But even if he was up, there was never a world where Braxton Jones would be fast enough or physically capable enough to reach that linebacker who was just screaming down. There should have been some kind of check out of that. Clearly, we just didn't have the look that we wanted, right? So you can talk about the offensive line not getting the blocks there, but at the end of the day, it was the play call that was the issue there. It was like the front that was there. So I think that is an interesting point.
I think when you heard from Coleman Shelton after the game, it was, I forget what exactly he said, but it was pretty clear. The offensive line heard that play call and went, we can't do that. Like they just knew this is not going to work. And you're asking guys to go out and try to execute something that they know is a losing battle. So that's the type of play call you want to avoid at all costs.
No, I agree. And your other point of, I know everyone loves talking about too high safeties right now and how the NFL is adjusting to that. But I feel like as a whole, like it looks like right now that defense has just a huge advantage right now. It's just because it's early in the offseason or early in the season. Preseason has like a different connotation than it has in the past. And I feel like as a whole, it's been reflected. Baker Mayfield took 7 sacks last week. Deshaun Watson and the Browns take an unreal amount of sacks too. And like Will Levis, I feel like takes sacks like incredibly hard too, and often doesn't even see him coming. Like I feel like the whole league, I think you do raise a good point. It's just like defense is constantly evolving, and sometimes early on in the season it can be tough to adjust. So I think those are a lot of like very good points because yeah, I feel like it's so easy to just watch a Twitter clip of again Coleman Shelton getting like bounced across the screen and just think, man, why did we even sign this guy? But then not thinking more deeply about is it wrong to even have him trying to do that? So I think those are a lot of pretty solid.
Don't
points.
get me wrong. I'm interested to see what Ryan Bates can do at center just because I was a guy who sat here for most of the offseason saying, I think Coleman Shelton can be a serviceable start. Even through like the first 3 weeks of the season, I was like, I think you can make it work with him. And at this point, I'm sitting here going, man, I can't help but wonder, especially if you're leaning into more power running concepts, get a guy with better anchor in there, then where are we sitting? But that is to say, I don't like the idea of ever worrying too much about one rep from an offensive lineman. And like on Twitter, it's a big thing to throw up one rep and say, this is what this guy is. And you ignore the other 60 reps of the game. And like Coleman Shelton, in my grades, he actually grades out decently. He does a good enough job, and I'd say 80% of the snaps. But the difference between him and some of the other guys around him is the ones where he doesn't do a good enough job, he really doesn't do a good enough job.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's that embarrassing moment that you find.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. At the end of the day, you're not going to win every rep.
I was curious when you talk about unrealistic asks for players and when you see like that option play we called on the goal line, the offensive line should have known right away that there's no shot that we're gonna actually pull this off. I'm curious, after week 1, Bears fans were looking for anyone and anybody to blame, and a name that came up a lot was our offensive line coach, Chris Morgan. I was wondering if you have any opinions on the actual input or the effect that an offensive line coach has on a team, because we have seen some Bears linemen leave the Bears and have some success this season, or at least in the first couple weeks. I'm wondering if you have any opinions on how much coaching factors in at such a high level in the NFL, and if it's his responsibility to kind of talk to Eberflus or Waldron and kind of give his input on what our offensive line can and can't do.
Yeah, typically on a lot of teams, definitely for the Bears, the O-line coach, Chris Morgan, he's the run game coordinator, right? And that's fairly common around the league that the offensive line coach is heavily involved in the run game because that is it's everything to the run game, right? Ultimately, your run game comes down to your offensive line's ability to execute things. So to me, that is a big red flag for Chris Morgan. And I've never talked to the guy, never sat here and asked him any questions about it. So I have a hard time ever ripping someone without having more merit than that to do it. But based on the preparedness of the offensive line coming into this year, coming into last year even, you have some questions about whether that was a merited promotion for him this offseason to run game coordinator, whether he really deserved to be the one offensive staff guy to stick around last year. And ultimately, when you look around, you say, look around the league and see some guys who had success elsewhere, I do raise some questions about that because I think Lucas Patrick is the loudest one that you see that with. And when you look at what Lucas Patrick did in the first 2 weeks where he was, so highly graded, that was New Orleans Saints team that ran the ball almost exclusively until they got a big lead. They were dominating on the ground, and Lucas Patrick's issue was always pass protection. So when you're not getting into those true pass sets, those true pass situations, a lot easier to hide, to mask stuff. Now, Grant, they were effectively running the ball. Patrick had a hand in that, but to me, he hadn't been tested yet. I didn't go check what he did last week. In week 3, they lost because they had to throw the football. And they only scored, I think it was 13 or 14 points. I don't know how Lucas Patrick did in that. I don't know how he did this week when they lost again, but the game script didn't go their way. There were times last year where Lucas Patrick looked pretty solid. He usually wasn't against a good team. It's usually when the game script went the right way. I mean, I remember even Cody Whitehair. I'm not sure how he's doing for the Raiders this year, but last year against the Raiders, Cody Whitehair had one of the best games for an offensive lineman of the year. He wasn't good, but you can have those one-off games where the game script goes right and it all fits right to where the offensive lineman wants to be.
No, that's fair. I know people pointed to Sam Mustipher too on the Ravens as having some production as well. Just seeing people come over to different teams, and I feel like digging a little more into that, there might be some more to that than you think.
Mustipher that's a really interesting one to me because he went to more gap power-based run schemes, which truly did fit his skill set better. He was never a good athlete. There's jokes about his RAS score and stuff like that. In the zone blocking scheme, you want athletes, and the Bears ran a zone blocking scheme. Then they flirted with some gap stuff, but they were definitely more, their identity was in the zone run game, and that was never his strong suit. That was never something that getting out in space, getting his hips in front of guys and being able to swivel them around was never something that Sam Mustipher did a lot of. So him just being able to get to a gap run scheme, add some weight, and be able to maybe try to bully some guys, that made a little more sense.
That's fair. Q, I gotta ask, what makes you so interested in the offensive line? Where has all of this come from? Or what's your background on this?
So I played O-line some in high school, and I got injured early in high school and was on crutches for the next 2 years, basically, just in and out of surgeries. But I always stayed in the offensive line room throughout all that. I always identified with those guys. I always saw myself as one of them, as the offensive lineman. So it's just something I cared about. And then as I, started to get more into creating content and stuff, I started out with stats, and it was always, I was a stats guy, but there's no offensive line stats.
No.
there's none that you can really trust. There's nothing that you can feel good. So it was always the mystery to me, right? Of like,
Mm-hmm.
I got into doing draft content and stuff like that eventually, and that got me really into studying tape. Like it's a sickness. It's not a good thing. It takes over your life. But so I just got pulled into offensive line tape of like that's what I care about. That's what I have fun watching. If you ever get into NFL draft tape or anything, you'll recognize this. There's just certain positions you feel and certain positions you don't. In
Mm-hmm.
my life, I have never beaten anyone in any sport with speed
Mm.
ever. Like I am slow, I am big, but I was strong, and that
Mm-hmm.
so that is what I understand. And that's what I have a good feel for watching and analyzing. And I'll tell you, I struggle watching the speed-based positions and really judging it just because it's a little foreign to me. So that's where I ended up with getting so into the offensive line. And I just think it's a blind spot for a lot of NFL fans and something that needs more quality content.
I absolutely agree. I wanted to ask a couple questions on just like personnel moving forward. So like I know Ryan Bates. I feel like a couple names to hit on is like one, the introduction of Matt Pryor in a post, like Nate Davis kind of rotating off now. He's like not usually listed as starters for these last 2 games. Ryan Bates, his return, and then Karan Amagashi. Like, what do you feel like the upcoming changes to personnel are gonna like ring? And you think anything is gonna what needs to change there? Do you think incoming personnel is gonna make a difference, or is this something that like we're gonna need to just fix in the future through like the draft or like signing people? I know like throughout the offseason, I know we talked a lot about like Connor Williams being available and being upset that we didn't sign Connor Williams. But like, what do you think from a personnel perspective, like what's looking forward for the Bears?
Yeah, I mean, so we can just take it left to right with that. Like left tackle, Braxton Jones. To me, I think Karan Amagaji needs to push him next year for starting. In my mind, that is what the Karan Amagaji pick was to do. Braxton is such a polarizing player to watch
For
because
sure.
I don't know if there's a single player in the NFL that is harder to tell if he's allowing pressure or not. It's because he ends up in the pocket so often and just he has good contact balance and he stays attached well, but his anchor is just not there, and he hasn't shown an ability to be an effective hand fighter before a player gets into his chest. And once a player's into your chest, if you don't have an anchor, you're going backwards. If you don't have that Darnell Wright ability to just sit down and say, "This is as far as you're going, buddy," and Braxton doesn't have that. So he's a really tough eval because he does limit the guy
Mm-hmm.
for about 2.5 to 3 seconds. But that really limits your ability to do deeper dropbacks, your ability to get into play action stuff. If a pass rusher is just hell bent on going forward and not
Mm-hmm.
reading the run. So to me, I want an upgrade at left tackle. I
Mm.
think Braxton Jones he can be serviceable. I think he was more serviceable with a quarterback who was quicker to flee the pocket than Caleb is
Mm.
in Justin Fields. Like I think some of his blemishes were easier to hide when you had a quarterback who was quicker to run. And I don't want a quarterback who's quick to run. Like I'd rather have the guy who can find space in the pocket and work around it.
For sure.
But so to me, that's Amagaji's future. And with Braxton, I think you want to keep him around because you don't know what Amagaji is yet. Maybe you can trade him, maybe not. I mean, I'd rather have him there as the known quantity in case than move him too early and end up with Amagaji not working out as quickly as you want it to.
That's fair.
At left guard, Tev's had a tough start to the year. His play has not been up to his standard that we saw for the last 2 years. He's been on the field, though. That does matter until today, at
True.
least.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think you'd have a hard time re-signing Tev. I think you have a hard time counting on him because if you're re-signing him, you're saying this is our starter. When he goes down, we need to play a backup. And his history says he's gonna go down at some point every single year. If I were the GM, I'd have a hard time paying much money into a guy with back and neck injuries like he's had, just because I don't know how that's gonna age. I don't know if that might be flaring up right now, and that's why he's had a rough start to the year. It's just there's a lot of unknowns there with it, and a lot that needs to go right for him for me to really make sense of re-signing him. Now, would I hate to see them re-sign him? No, I love Tevin Jacobs, but
For sure.
I just don't know if it's in the cards. At center, I was very disappointed they didn't draft a center this year.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of the best center classes we've seen in a decade. There were so many guys. The guy who was starting for the Rams today was a guy I wanted the Bears to draft badly. Went in the 6th round, Bo Limmer. I just wanted them to get a guy who they could sit behind someone and say, hey, next year we're not going to be starting a rookie center. We're going to have this guy like ready to go, whether that was Hunter Norzad, Bo Limmer, Matt Lee out of Miami, or Jacob Monk, who went to Green Bay. I love it when Green Bay drafts offensive linemen. I like it's just so much fun. So I think next year you're probably looking at a rookie. A lot of the free agent options at center, let's be real, there's only maybe 10 centers in the league who are good.
Yeah.
It's a position where you hide guys. And I mean, most guards and tackles in the NFL played tackle their entire life, right? They were the best player on their team, best offensive lineman, and they played tackle until they got to a higher level, usually the NFL, and moved to guard or whatever. At center, you tend to have guys who've played center for a long time. It's a lot harder for a tackle to move to center at the college level. You do have guys who played tackle in high school and then became centers their freshman year of college. Guys like a Jarrett Patterson out of Notre Dame, who's with the Texans now. But for the most part, those guys are centers. They've been centers all through college, and they're not the athletes, the high level skill players that you see at tackle and at guard. There's only a handful of them in the league, and they tend not to become free agents. Like Drew Dahlman might become a free agent from Atlanta. But I mean, Dahlman to me is he's a better Coleman Shelton. He's not a good pass blocker. He's a really good run blocker. I'd rather try to get a well-rounded guy in the draft, wherever that may be. Hope that there's a guy there. I haven't gotten too deep into that yet. At right guard, I mean, you got Matt Pryor right now / Nate Davis. I expect Nate Davis to be off the roster next year. I think his time is done at this point, unless Tev's down and he just plays great from here on out. But his play's been so up and down here. I have a hard time believing that. Matt Pryor, ultimately, I think Matt Pryor is a 6th offensive lineman that you love to have. He can play tackle. He can play guard. When I watch his guard tape, I can't help but sit there and think, this guy's a tackle. He's so long. He's so leggy. And so he has a hard time working in confined spaces. But if I watch him at tackle, I'm probably saying, this guy would probably do better in a phone booth at guard where he's not as exposed with because he has slow feet, slow hands. Like he has deficiencies at both spots. I think his deficiencies are probably wider at guard than they are at tackle at times. But I don't know if he's a real solution at guard long term. I think he's a 6th lineman who you love to have. I think he's great depth on the roster because of his versatility, but I don't know that he's something you can count on going forward. I think he has a really hard time with guys with quicker hands, good hand fighters, because he's slow. He can stun guys at contact, but when he misses, that recovery is not there. A guy can just fly right by him. And then at right tackle, Darnell, that's your guy. Like that's the one sure thing on this offensive line right now that to me, he's playing through a back injury. It is definitely impacting his play right now. He does not look like the same guy. He's a warrior fighting through it, but as long as that back injury isn't something that you worry about long term, I see no reason why you're concerned with him. His play isn't great right now, but it's still probably the best on the offensive line.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great breakdown. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about, especially like Jenkins leaving as well, thinking about all but one roster spot on the offensive line being pretty ready to move or interchangeable for sure.
Realistically, next year, Ryan Bates is probably starting somewhere. You're probably starting one rookie and starting one free agent. And you have another rookie behind Ryan Bates who might be able to take it over. Like I'm thinking you spent a 2nd and a 3rd round pick on it, something like that, or maybe you spend 2 seconds because you got 2 seconds. But I think you have 2 rookies, a free agent, and Ryan Bates, and you start the best 3 of those.
Yeah. Yeah, that's that'll be interesting, man. So, I mean, I know the offensive line is going to be a topic of discussion for the rest of the season. So, hopefully things continue to improve like they did today. But I think that's all that we have for this section. Q, I really want to thank you again for coming on. I feel like you provided a super good perspective for the offensive line. I feel like you're a guy who really knows ball, especially on the offensive line. I feel like that was very apparent, man.
Hey, man, I'm just trying to learn it still. If over at the On Tap Sportsnet YouTube channel, me and the Bears On Tap co-host Ron Luce, we're doing tape breakdowns. Hopefully every week. We're trying to do every week. We'll see how our schedules work out. But I'll tell you what, we did one last week. I learned so much from Ron in that first one because Ron played O-line in college at St. Xavier. So he really I'm trying to know it. He knows it. So it's all just a learning process, man.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thanks again for coming on. I think that's all that we're going to have here. But Q, if you have anything else to add, if you want to plug anything, but go ahead. But I think we're ready to wrap it up.
Yeah, just check out Bears on Tap podcast. Check out the Shaving Points podcast for We talk every game every week, and make sure to read my stuff over at ontapsportsnet.com. And thank you guys for having me on. It was fun.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah,
man.
absolutely.
Yeah. I hope you have a great day, man.
Okay, welcome back from that interview with Quinten Krzysko.
Wow.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed listening to that debate. Man, that guy knew so much more about offensive line, scouting, football, offense in general. We're two defensive guys.
Q knows ball.
Defense. He knows ball. And he was very fun to talk to, very friendly, very personable. Definitely gives off the vibe of someone that's done, this more than we have. Yeah, that was a great conversation. Connor, what was something you took away from that conversation?
Q's a great guy. I think the biggest takeaway that I had was about the discrepancies that exist around offensive line. I think just ranking offensive line and assessing offensive line is such a difficult thing to do, and I think that became more apparent as the interview went on. Because for me, I know that in the articles that I've written about the Bears offensive line, I love including Twitter clips of Coleman Shelton getting embarrassed by Jeffrey Simmons or that linebacker from the Colts, but learning more about less of being about Coleman Shelton sucking. And I'm not going to say that Coleman Shelton, after this interview, I've learned that Coleman Shelton is good. I'm not going to say that. I still think he's a very bad player, but trying to be a little more fair to some of the assignments that he has, and saying maybe that's unfair or unrealistic to expect Shelton to be able to make that block in general, right? So trying to be a little more nuanced with your assessments of the offensive line, I think, was my biggest takeaway. And also, at the end of the day, you don't know what the assignment was. You don't know what was called there. So grading all of this stuff it's a very hard avenue to walk down. And I think moving forward, I'm going to try to be more fair to the offensive line and just be a little better with my assessments of saying, look, just looking at PFF rankings or sacks given up doesn't tell the whole story. I think moving on is just an imperfect thing to do. And I'm glad that there's people like you who are willing to dive deep and really give a good assessment to these offensive linemen.
Yeah, I agree, man. It is so tough to not see, especially when the game's going bad and you're frustrated, and then you see one clip of Darnell Wright. I remember distinctly, you have a clip of Darnell Wright letting up a sack or some big hit, and you think, God, why do we have this guy? This guy was supposed to be our best player, and he's letting him up. But like talking to Q and reading his articles and reading his breakdowns of our line, you'd see like, okay, he is like far and away our best lineman and rarely makes mistakes. But when you only watch those one singular clips in a vacuum, he looks like the worst, right? So I agree, Connor, that it's important to take the alignment assessments as a whole and listen to people like Q who are willing to watch the game 5 times and not just make your assessment based on a couple clips you see on Twitter.
Especially watch a loss 5 times. Especially watch the Bears offense 5 times in those early games. That's a nightmare.
Yeah, absolutely. That is true.
He's the hero we need.
Yeah. Well, that'll do it for today's episode of the Chicagolandians. If you guys enjoyed this episode, why not leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify? And if you guys want to see more Chicagolandians content, you can find us on, at this point, most social medias. You got to have to look pretty hard to not find us. I think LinkedIn is a space we might be entering soon. Yeah, that's probably a space that needs Chicago sports content. But you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok at Chicagolandians everywhere. And as always, we just say bear down.
Bear down, baby.
Woo.